He was only 3 years old, bright-eyed, full of life, and utterly fearless in the face of nature's vastness. One moment, Jaryd Atadero was hiking with a trusted church group along a scenic Colorado trail. The next, he was gone. No cry for help, no signs of struggle, just silence. What began as a simple outing in the crisp October air of 1999 spiraled into one of the most haunting and baffling disappearances in modern wilderness history. As search teams scoured the rugged terrain and helicopters circled overhead, the mystery only deepened. Years later, when Jaryd's remains were finally discovered, the questions grew darker, not clearer. The condition of his clothes, the impossible location of his bones, and the eerie stillness of the discovery site left investigators and his family grappling with an unsettling truth. This was no ordinary case of a child lost in the woods. This is the story of Jaryd Atadero, a case where every answer raised more questions. Thank you for choosing my video among thousands of videos out there to watch. Helping me with a subscription of yours is very small but very big and too valuable. Jaryd Atadero was the kind of child who seemed to shine from the inside out. At just 3 years old, he had an infectious smile, boundless curiosity, and a fearless love for the outdoors. With eyes full of wonder and a playful spirit that couldn't sit still, Jaryd brought light into every room he entered. He was the youngest in a small, tightly knit family. Just his father Alan and his older sister Jocelyn, and their bond was unshakable. Alan Atadero, a single father, following his separation from Jaryd's mother, Stacy McKissick, had devoted his life to raising his 2 children with patience, presence, and love. A former city dweller, Alan had chosen a quieter, more intentional life in the mountains of Colorado. He moved his family to Poudre Canyon, nestled in the rugged beauty of the Roosevelt National Forest, where he and his twin brother Arlen operated a modest mountain resort. There, among the whispering trees and winding trails, Jaryd came alive. The forest wasn't just scenery. It was his playground, his world. He would run ahead on the trails, calling out bird names, chasing squirrels, laughing as wind rushed past his cheeks. He was bold, tireless, and joyful, soaking in every detail of the wilderness, like it was made just for him. Alan, deeply spiritual and passionate about mentorship, found both support and community through the Christian Singles Network, a group of fellow believers that provided a sense of purpose and belonging after his divorce. The group embraced Alan and his children, often including them in social events, outings, and family-friendly activities. Jaryd and Jocelyn quickly became fixtures in the community, their bright energy welcomed by everyone. Alan was grateful for the help. Raising children alone wasn't easy, but in the mountains surrounded by nature and a community of faith, he found healing. The rhythm of mountain life suited them: quiet mornings, the smell of pine in the air, evenings by the fire. For Jaryd, it was paradise. He was thriving in every sense of the word. He had a fearless innocence about him that Alan cherished, a trust in the world that made him bold but vulnerable. Nature had become a part of Jaryd's soul, a space where he felt free and safe. Alan had done everything he could to build a peaceful life for his children, one rooted in simplicity, love, and connection. But none of them could have known that the same wild spaces that had brought them joy would soon become the setting for a mystery that would haunt them forever. It was October 1999, and the day began with the kind of innocent excitement you'd expect from a group of families setting off into the Colorado wilderness. The Christian Singles Network had organized an outing near the Atadero family's mountain resort, a modest plan to take the children on a visit to a local fish hatchery. The idea was simple: a peaceful walk, some educational fun, and a chance to enjoy the crisp autumn air together. Jaryd, as always, was excited. Alan, trusting the group, with whom he had grown close, agreed to let Jaryd and Jocelyn join the others on the trip. It was a decision made in good faith, built on a foundation of friendship, community, and shared values. What happened next would shatter that trust forever. Unbeknownst to Alan, the adults in the group made a sudden, fateful decision to alter their route. Instead of the planned walk to the hatchery, they veered off onto the Big South Trail, a scenic but challenging path that wound its way through the rugged landscape along the Cache La Poudre River. The trail was known for its dramatic beauty, towering pines, golden aspens, and breathtaking vistas. But it was not a typical family hike. It was narrow, rocky, and steep, with parts that ran dangerously close to cliffs and drop-offs. There were no fences, no signs warning of danger, and little to no cell phone reception in case of emergency. Still, the group pressed on, children in tow. Jaryd, just 3 years old, was the youngest of the group by far. And yet no special precautions were taken to keep him close. No one insisted on holding his hand or walking beside him. As the group moved along the trail, they began to spread out, some hikers moving ahead, others lagging behind. Jaryd, with his usual enthusiasm and fearless curiosity, moved eagerly along the path. He wasn't afraid. He was in his element. Witnesses later described him as cheerful, engaged, fascinated by the forest around him. At one point, 2 fishermen near the riverbank spotted a small boy walking alone. He wore a white t-shirt emblazoned with the word Walmart and simple blue jeans. He didn't look lost. He didn't cry out. He walked calmly, as if he belonged there. The fishermen assumed he was part of the nearby group and thought little of it. They didn't know they had just seen the last confirmed sighting of Jaryd Atadero. Moments later, the forest was pierced by a single sharp scream, a high-pitched sound that echoed through the trees and then vanished into silence. Those who heard it weren't sure what it meant. Jocelyn, Jaryd's sister, later described it as strange and ambiguous, like someone playing a game or like someone in pain. That scream would become a haunting echo that marked the moment everything changed. The group quickly realized Jaryd was no longer with them. At first, they believed he had simply run ahead. They called his name, scanned the trail, expecting him to appear around the next bend. But he didn't. Panic crept in. Their voices grew louder. Still no sign of him. What had begun as a light-hearted family outing had suddenly transformed into something much darker. Jaryd was gone without a sound, without a trace, swallowed by the forest he loved. The trail had grown quiet. Golden autumn light filtered softly through the canopy above, casting long shadows on the forest floor as the hiking group pressed forward along the Big South Trail. Jaryd Atadero, just 3 years old, had been walking with them, at times beside the adults, but often a few steps ahead, his small feet bouncing with energy on the narrow, uneven path. His cheerful curiosity had become a familiar rhythm to those around him. He was fascinated by the trees, the sound of rushing water, the feel of twigs snapping beneath his sneakers. But at some point, without anyone noticing, Jaryd drifted out of sight. Near a bend in the trail, two fishermen standing along the Cache La Poudre River caught a glimpse of a small boy walking alone. He wasn't crying, he wasn't calling out. He moved with quiet confidence, wearing a white t-shirt with the word Walmart printed across it and a pair of blue jeans. The fisherman watched for a moment, assuming he was simply part of the nearby hiking group. The sight of children in the wilderness wasn't unusual in that area. They thought nothing of it. And then, just minutes later, the forest was broken by a scream. Sharp, sudden, high-pitched, it rang out through the trees like a blade. It startled those nearby, including the fishermen, but it came without context. There was no following cry, no words, no sound of struggle, only an eerie, unsettling silence that settled heavily in its wake. Jocelyn Atadero, Jaryd's older sister, would later say the scream had been ambiguous. It didn't sound exactly like someone being hurt, but not entirely like someone playing either. She said it might have been Jaryd reacting to someone sneaking up behind him, like in a game. But whatever its meaning, the result was clear. Jaryd was gone. As the group began to realize he was missing, confusion turned quickly into fear. At first, they assumed he had wandered just ahead, hidden by a curve in the trail or a thicket of brush. They called his name, scanning the path and peering through the trees. But he didn't answer. Minutes stretched into more minutes, and still there was no sign of him. Some adults fanned out along the trail, retracing their steps. Others stayed with the children, trying to maintain calm. But the growing panic among the adults became unmistakable. Yet, in those critical early moments, when every second could have made a difference, no one reached for a phone. No one called emergency services. Cell reception was poor, but not entirely absent. Still, there was hesitation, disorganization, and denial. Perhaps they feared overreacting. Perhaps they simply couldn't believe a child could vanish so completely, so quickly. They searched for nearly 2 hours before anyone outside the group was alerted. Back at the mountain resort, Alan Atadero remained unaware of the unfolding nightmare. His children had been entrusted to people he knew, people he trusted. The hours ticked by in silence. When word finally reached him that Jaryd was missing, Alan's world shattered. Witnesses later described his reaction as primal. He ran to his car, pounding his chest, screaming, "They lost my baby! They lost my baby!" His cries echoed across the canyon, raw and heart-wrenching. But by the time authorities were finally brought in, the trail had already grown cold. The moment authorities were contacted, the search for Jaryd Atadero escalated with a speed and intensity that reflected the urgency of the situation. Local law enforcement and Larimer County search and rescue mobilized quickly. The terrain was treacherous, steep ridges, thick forest, and unpredictable weather. But search teams poured into the area, determined to find the missing boy. Jaryd Atadero, frantic and shattered, watched as the peaceful mountain haven he had built transformed overnight into a base camp of chaos and desperation. Officers with dogs swept the trails. Volunteers combed the riverside. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the tree canopy for any trace of movement. At first, many believed Jaryd would be found quickly. He was small, yes, but the trail was finite, and young children were often located within hours. One of the search leaders, Bill Nelson, a now retired undersheriff, later admitted he expected it to be routine. "We thought we'd find him before midnight," he said. "He was just a child, maybe hiding, maybe scared. But we thought it was a matter of time." That optimism did not last long. As daylight faded and temperatures dropped, the search widened, but Jaryd remained missing. Every hour that passed was a dagger. And then tragedy struck again. On October 3rd, a UH-1 Huey helicopter dispatched from F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming, re-entered the mountain corridor to assist from the air. On board were 4 military personnel and Mark Sheets, a volunteer from Larimer County Search and Rescue. Sheets hadn't originally been scheduled for the flight. He had stepped in for a colleague, hoping to contribute. The aircraft had stopped briefly at Fort Collins Loveland Municipal Airport to refuel before returning to the rugged canyon. But soon after re-entering the forest, the helicopter began to struggle. The weight of the fuel load, combined with the thin mountain air, created a deadly combination. As the rotors fought to maintain lift, Sheets, lying near the open hatch, spoke 4 chilling words into the intercom. "We need altitude now." The co-pilot responded quietly, "I know, but I can't. We're going in." Seconds later, the rotors clipped the tops of trees. The blade shattered, sending debris slicing into the forest. A massive branch pierced the helicopter cabin, striking one of the crew. Then came the crash, violent, sudden, and devastating. The helicopter broke into 3 pieces as it slammed into the mountainside. Yet somehow, the engines kept screaming burning fuel, echoing through the forest like a siren of disaster. Miraculously, the crew survived, but Mark Sheets wasn't as lucky. He had been thrown from the wreckage, unconscious, pinned, and badly injured. A jagged, 13-inch wound tore through his leg, exposing bone. He suffered a severe concussion, fractured vertebrae, and a broken shoulder. Search teams, now diverted to rescue one of their own, raced to the crash site and kicked in a window to pull him out, saving his life. But the emotional toll was staggering. The search for a missing child had now led to a near-fatal military accident, and attention from the press exploded. 17 satellite trucks lined the roads. Reporters in fur coats wandered the trails, asking questions that had no answers. What had begun as a desperate rescue mission was descending into chaos. And Jaryd, still missing, was now at the center of a national spectacle. Within days of Jaryd's disappearance, the quiet trails of Roosevelt National Forest had become the stage for a national drama. What had begun as a local search for a missing child escalated into a media firestorm. News vans rolled into Poudre Canyon in waves. Satellite dishes sprouted beside parked trucks like strange metallic mushrooms. TV anchors dressed in pristine coats and makeup stood under towering pines, delivering live reports to a fascinated nation. Jaryd's story struck a nerve, and it wasn't long before the case drew comparisons to one of the most infamous unsolved cases in Colorado history, the murder of John Beneath Ramsey. Suddenly, everyone had a theory, and everyone wanted their voice heard. The line between search and spectacle blurred, then vanished completely. Psychics called in from around the country claiming visions or spiritual insight into Jaryd's whereabouts. One self-proclaimed tracker showed up barefoot with a donkey, insisting he could sense the boy's path. A Native American spiritualist performed rituals by moonlight, asking the mountain itself to return Jaryd. Some came in earnest, others came for attention, but none brought answers. While professionals pushed deeper into the forest, combing rivers and climbing ridgelines, the circus grew louder. The media, ever hungry for drama, shifted focus from the search to the people involved. In particular, suspicion began to cast a long cold shadow over Jaryd Atadero. He had already lost his son. Now he was being scrutinized, picked apart on television, online forums, and in community whispers. Commentators speculated about his mental state. Some questioned whether he had been negligent. Others went further cruelly, suggesting darker possibilities. Harsh letters and accusatory emails poured in. Strangers questioned his parenting. Anonymous messages accused him of knowing more than he claimed. Some invoked religious themes, implying Jaryd's disappearance was some sort of divine punishment or karmic result. It was a cruel twist of fate. While Alan had opened himself to the world in the hope of finding help, what he received instead was judgment. And yet, he didn't break. Grief-stricken and exhausted, Alan refused to retreat. He continued showing up for interviews, answering every call, standing before microphones and cameras with a father's desperate honesty. "I just want my son back," he would say. "That's all I want." Behind him, the search raged on, teams climbing hillsides, diving into icy streams, crawling through dense underbrush. Helicopters flew overhead daily. Search dogs sniffed every possible trail. Yet no new evidence appeared. The forest, vast and ancient, kept its silence. The days dragged into weeks, and the spectacle began to wear thin. News outlets turned their attention elsewhere. Anchors left. Trucks rolled out. But the questions remained. Where had Jaryd gone? How could a child vanish so completely in broad daylight on a known trail? Why had no trace been found? No shoe, no scrap of clothing, no sign of struggle. As the media pulled away, the crowds thinned. But the ache of not knowing the one constant in Alan's life only deepened. When the last of the search teams packed up and the media glare finally faded, the silence that followed was unbearable. For most people, the story of Jaryd Atadero became just another unresolved mystery, a footnote in a year of news, filed away and forgotten. But for Jaryd Atadero, the story had only just begun. Every morning, he woke to the same nightmare: his son was gone, and no one could explain how or why. There was no body, no closure, no truth to hold on to. Just 1,000 questions and a hollow ache that never left. While the world moved on, Alan could not. He refused to. He threw himself into the search with relentless determination. He printed thousands of flyers, each one bearing Jaryd's smiling face, and posted them everywhere, on store windows, gas station walls, community bulletin boards. He handed them to strangers, drove to nearby towns, and made late-night phone calls, chasing down rumors. Jaryd's missing poster wasn't just a plea for help. It was a symbol of a father's refusal to let his child be forgotten. Alan gave interviews whenever asked, sometimes to local reporters, other times on national platforms. His voice often trembled, but he spoke anyway. He talked about Jaryd's laugh, his love for birds, his fearless nature. He begged anyone with information to come forward, no matter how small the detail. At night, when the world was quiet, Alan would sift through old reports, maps, and weather data, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. He read about child disappearances, wilderness survival, and search and rescue tactics. He even consulted with psychics, not because he believed in all of them, but because when every rational option fails, the irrational begins to look like hope. Every call that came in stirred a fragile mixture of hope and dread. Each new lead raised his pulse. Most turned out to be dead ends. A few were cruel hoaxes. Still, he followed up on them all. He couldn't risk missing the one that mattered. Time became his greatest enemy. Seasons changed, and so did people's memories. Fewer tips came in. Fewer reporters called. The volunteers who had once filled the woods with their shouts and flashlights returned to their lives. The story that had once captured a nation's attention faded from headlines, replaced by new tragedies and newer faces. But Alan didn't stop. He kept Jaryd's bedroom exactly as it had been, as if his son might walk back through the door at any moment. He spoke to him often quietly when no one was around. The pain didn't lessen. It simply settled deeper into the bones. Alan often said the worst part wasn't grief, it was the not knowing. What had Jaryd seen in those final moments? Had he been scared? Was he alone? Was he still out there somewhere, waiting? These questions haunted him in the empty hours between midnight and morning, and yet, amid the pain, something unshakable remained: hope. Fragile, but stubborn, it lived on in Alan's every breath. Not because he refused to accept reality, but because without hope there was nothing left. For Alan Atadero, the search for Jaryd wasn't just a mission, it was a promise. One he would never break. 4 long years passed in silence. The forest that had swallowed Jaryd Atadero gave nothing back. No answers, no signs, not even a whisper of what had happened on that October day in 1999. Alan Atadero carried on, worn thin by grief, but unwilling to let go. The trail had gone cold, the headlines had vanished, and most of the world had moved on. But Alan never stopped searching. And then, in the summer of 2003, the mountains finally stirred. 2 local hikers, Rob Osborne and Gareth Watts, were exploring the backcountry of Poudre Canyon, a dense stretch of wilderness near the Big South Trail, when something strange caught their eyes. A flash of color, unmistakable, artificial, stood out among the browns and greens of the forest floor. As they approached, they found items that stopped them cold: a tiny Disney brand Tarzan sneaker, a pair of blue pants, and a brown fleece sweater, all arranged oddly on the ground near the edge of a steep outcrop. The clothes looked remarkably clean, too clean, not torn, not stained, not scattered. Beside the clothing were fragments of human remains, including a piece of a skull and a molar. The hikers backed away and called authorities immediately. The site was secured, and forensic teams began working with quiet precision, collecting the remains with care and reverence. It didn't take long for initial DNA testing to suggest what no one had dared to hope or fear. The remains were almost certainly Jaryd Atadero's. Later, with more advanced DNA analysis, the match would be confirmed as 100%. Jaryd had been found. But the discovery, rather than bringing resolution, only deepened the mystery. The location of the remains raised immediate questions. The site lay nearly 500 vertical feet above the Big South Trail, up a steep, rugged incline that even experienced hikers would find challenging. It was not a gentle slope. It was unforgiving terrain, littered with loose rock and jagged outcroppings. No one could explain how a 3-year-old child in tennis shoes could have made that climb. There were no trails leading to the spot, no clear path, and no one, despite the massive search conducted in the area, had ever found those remains before. The condition of the clothing was equally troubling. The brown fleece, the pants, the shoes, they showed no obvious signs of animal damage. No blood, no tearing, no claw marks, and the pants, oddly, were turned inside out. Forensic investigators noted the strangeness of this detail. Could Jaryd have undressed himself? Possibly. But why? And how, in that harsh terrain? It seemed unlikely a child that young could or would take his pants off while struggling through brush and boulders. The pieces didn't add up. Not to the trained searchers, not to the forensic team, and certainly not to Alan. What had happened to Jaryd between the moment he disappeared and the moment his remains were discovered? Where had he been for 4 years? And why? After all that time, did the forest return him in such a clean, composed, almost curated way? These were the questions that began to spread, not just among investigators, but among the public, who were once again drawn to the case. The boy who had vanished without a sound had returned just as mysteriously as if the wilderness itself had chosen to reveal only part of the truth. With Jaryd's remains finally recovered, the question on everyone's mind shifted from, where is he to? What happened to him? Authorities were quick to propose a theory, a mountain lion attack. It was a narrative that seemed to fit on the surface. The Colorado wilderness was home to cougars, and a child of Jaryd's size would have been vulnerable. Perhaps they said Jaryd had wandered too far, lost his footing, and been attacked. But that explanation didn't hold up for long. Wildlife experts, forensic anthropologists, and search coordinators began expressing doubts. The clothing raised the first red flags. It was too clean, too intact. In known animal attacks, especially by predators like cougars, clothing is typically shredded, soaked in blood, or torn away during the struggle. But Jaryd's sweater pants and sneakers were mostly undamaged. The pants being inside out was especially odd. Not typical in animal attacks, and not easily explained as a child's act of confusion. Even stranger, the items were found neatly grouped together, not scattered as one would expect from a predator dragging and consuming its prey. Mountain lions don't leave their meals in one place. They dragged them to safety. They return to feed again. Bones are usually dispersed, gnawed or buried. But Jaryd's remains were localized. His molar and skull fragment lay in close proximity to his clothing, untouched by apparent trauma. And then there was the geography. The site where Jaryd's remains were discovered sat high above the trail, 500 vertical feet over treacherous terrain. Could a toddler have climbed that high alone? It was difficult to believe. Some argued it was simply a tragic anomaly that Jaryd had wandered up a hidden path and succumbed to the elements. But those who had combed the mountain for days back in 1999 were unconvinced. That area had been searched, they insisted. Not just passed by, but covered thoroughly. The idea that they had missed an obvious pile of clothing and remains was hard to swallow. That led to darker theories. Perhaps Jaryd hadn't died on the trail that day at all. Perhaps he had been taken abducted, and his remains returned years later. If that were true, the implications were chilling. Had someone been watching the search? Had they waited for the world to forget before quietly placing Jaryd's remains on the mountain? If so, why and who? As these questions spread, the story once again attracted speculation from all corners. Some pointed to the inconsistencies as evidence of foul play. Others leaned into more far-fetched theories: a hidden recluse in the woods, a ritualistic crime, or something supernatural. There were even whispers of cover-ups or suppressed evidence. But no theory could neatly explain everything: the clean clothes, the geographic impossibility, the absence of trauma, the eerie stillness of the scene. The truth remained maddeningly out of reach. What happened to Jaryd Atadero remains one of the most unsettling wilderness cases in modern memory. Not just because he disappeared, but because the answers, when they finally came, made even less sense than the disappearance itself. After the discovery of Jaryd's remains in 2003, most of the world breathed a sad, quiet sigh of closure and turned the page. But for Alan Atadero, there was no such comfort. The questions still gnawed at him. The bizarre details of the discovery refused to fade. And most of all, the pain of not knowing how his son had spent his final moments haunted him in a way that sleep could never cure. Yet, in the face of that consuming grief, Alan chose something remarkable. He transformed pain into purpose. He refused to let Jaryd become a forgotten face, a file number lost in a cabinet of cold cases. Instead, he became the voice his son no longer had. Alan began by doing what many could not bring themselves to do: speaking. He shared Jaryd's story publicly and frequently, not just in interviews or at memorials, but in lectures, school events, and community forums. He stood in front of strangers and relived his worst day over and over again, not for sympathy, but for awareness. He wanted people to understand what was lost: not just a child, but an entire life of possibilities. Soon, Alan put Jaryd's story into writing. He authored books detailing the timeline, the failures, the haunting discoveries, and most importantly, the love that never dimmed. Missing the Jaryd Atadero story became more than a tribute. It became a call to action. In its pages, Alan outlined everything he had learned, not just about his son's case, but about how these tragedies unfold and how they are mishandled. He called out the flaws in search protocols, the breakdown in communication, and the lack of accountability in early response efforts. But he didn't stop with the past, he pushed for a better future. Alan became an advocate for outdoor safety reform, campaigning for improved child safety procedures in parks and wilderness areas. He called for better coordination among search and rescue teams, more stringent oversight of youth, outing groups, and public education on how fast and quietly a child can vanish in natural terrain. His efforts weren't met with universal applause. There were those who thought he should move on, accept what happened, let the mystery fade. But Alan couldn't not when the answers didn't align, not when he knew there were lessons to be learned that might save other children. He kept Jaryd's memory alive, not through mourning, but through movement. Along the way, Alan connected with other families, mothers and fathers who had lost their children in inexplicable, often overlooked ways. Some in national parks, others in small towns or deep forests. Together, they formed a quiet network of strength and sorrow, bonded not by shared conclusions, but by shared persistence. To these families, Alan became more than a grieving father. He became a guiding force, a living example. That advocacy is a form of love, and remembrance can be louder than silence. Even Jaryd's old bedroom, preserved just as he had left it, became a kind of shrine, not of loss, but of promise. His toys, his posters, even the piece of his recovered skull kept reverently under glass, all served to remind Alan of the vow he had made. Jaryd would never be forgotten, not as long as his father still had breath. The recovery of Jaryd's remains should have closed the story, but it didn't. Instead, it opened a deeper, darker chapter, one filled with even more questions, contradictions, and discomfort. The facts remained unsettling. A 3-year-old vanished on a well-traveled trail in broad daylight. No cries, no tracks. Then 4 years later, his remains were found high above that trail, clean, composed, and eerily untouched by time or trauma. The official case is closed in name only. Jaryd is confirmed deceased, but the how and the why remain suspended in speculation. Theories persist, none of them conclusive. The mountain lion explanation still floats in the official record, but it's been quietly questioned by almost everyone who has examined the details. The abduction theory, once considered a stretch, has gained traction, especially among law enforcement and search veterans who maintain that Jaryd could not have climbed to that remote area on his own. Some believe the remains were moved there later. Some believe Jaryd may have been held somewhere for a time. Still others fall into darker speculation, suggesting human involvement too disturbing to voice publicly, or circumstances so strange they border on the unexplainable. Over the years, the case has attracted whispers of cover-ups, conspiracy, and even supernatural suggestion. But no matter how far the theories go, no single explanation fits all the evidence. That is the heart of what makes Jaryd's case so haunting. It resists understanding. To this day, former search coordinators, forensic analysts, and even wilderness trackers disagree. Some say it doesn't look like an animal attack. Others say it doesn't match any known abduction pattern. Many say it's like nothing they've ever seen. Jaryd Atadero too has sifted through every theory. He's read them, debated them, even lived among them. But in the end, he knows that none of them bring his son back. What matters to him now is that people keep asking, that they don't let Jaryd's story disappear again into the silence. For Alan, the case has become more than personal. It's a reminder that not every truth is convenient, and not every disappearance ends in understanding. Some mysteries remain unsolved because they don't want to be solved. They exist in the margins of what we accept, daring us to look deeper. And Jaryd's story, this quiet, bewildering tragedy in the heart of the Colorado wilderness, has become one such mystery. The forest gave back his bones, but not the truth. It returned his shoes, his sweater, his skull, but it held tight to the real answers, perhaps forever. And so the story lives on, not just in police files or news clippings, but in the voices of those who remember. It echoes in Alan's speeches, in his writing, in the annual Declaration of Recreational Safety Awareness Week, which was named in Jaryd's honor by Governor Bill Ritter. Jaryd Atadero may be gone, but he is not lost. Not to those who continue to speak his name. Not to a father who refused to let him fade. Not to the growing circle of people who still, after all these years, quietly ask the same question: what really happened on that trail? Thank you so much for watching till the end. Your support truly means the world to me. If this video brought you value or resonated with you in any way, feel free to leave a little comment or hit subscribe so we can keep sharing more moments together. See you in the next one.